to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have reached the 12th day of August. Today is Tuesday, the 12th day of August. Excuse me, it's the 11th day of August. I got the date wrong. At least I got the day right. So it's the 11th of August. It is a pleasure to be with you today for our second program in this week's schedule. Had a wonderful time yesterday. My wife, when she came home last evening, asked me if I was satisfied with the program, and the first thing I mentioned was that we had a call from John at the beginning of our second hour, which was great, and it was a wonderful call. And then we got into Madison, and I don't get in there without getting excited. So yes, I told her that I was comfortable with yesterday's program, but that we really weren't making when I say we weren't making progress, I think we are making progress. We're just not going through the document in nearly the rate that I anticipated. I'm thumbing through a book here. I'm thumbing through Gary Wills' book as I speak. So. Anyway, welcome to the program. We would love to hear from you. We've been into James Madison's Federalist number 10 in some depth all last week and yesterday's program, and I anticipate that we will be doing the same today here at the Virtual Center. We would love to hear from you if you have things you would like to say, concerns, thoughts, ideas, suggestions, criticisms, whatever you might have about Federalist 10 or about maybe something I said about Federalist 10, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I welcome hearing from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And again, I remind you of our Facebook page, and I call your attention to a posting that I put on Facebook on Saturday, I believe, dealing with the issue of behavior, human behavior in groups, as opposed to behavior when we're alone. And I think we'll probably touch on this particular issue as part of today's program. So again, please do not feel, and John was a little bit apologetic when he called yesterday, and I don't want anybody to feel that way. I think if you've listened to any number of these programs, you know that as I get into this material, I get quite excited about it, but I don't want that message to get across that it's not a good time to call. It is always a good time to call. I can always retool and reboot. In other words, just step back and start again. So by all means, don't worry about it, because it seems to me if you go to the trouble of picking up the phone and dialing in, then you've got something that's on your mind right then, and we all want to share in that. So again, please do not hesitate to give us a call if the desire to do so happens to hit you. Don't try to tie it into the middle of the program, because I get kind of carried away here, and if you're waiting for a logical stopping point, you might lose your whole train of thought if you do that. So by all means, feel free to call whenever the inclination strikes you. yesterday we were into Federalist number 10. We got a little way into the document, and we reached what I believe was a good point to stop right at the end of our program. It seemed to be a logical place. And the reason I say that is because we can kind of summarize where we are, up to where we are, and it forms a kind of a neat package. You'll recall that Madison set out to address the issue of factions, the violence of factions. And he says there are two ways to go about this. You can either eliminate the causes, or you can manage or control the effects. The first issue then he takes up is eliminating the causes. And he said, if you want to eliminate the causes, you can go about it two ways. You can take away people's freedom to belong to factions, or you can make everybody the same. In other words, you can brainwash or indoctrinate your population to the point that everybody believes the same thing, has the same passion, has the same interests, etc. Then we went through each of these, or Madison did. Madison said that to take away people's freedom is a non-option. He says that cure would be worse than the disease. So in effect then, and I don't want to, every time I get to this point, in considering Federalist number 10, I don't want to let it go without making a firm statement, because this point is very important. What Madison is doing is saying that individual freedom is a sine qua non of our republic. In other words, Madison comes down firmly and says we will not tamper with individual freedom. So, and of course, a lot of people focus on that and go to that as as being the key to the document. For them, it is. Madison then turns to the issue of making everybody the same, getting rid of the problems of the violence of factions by making everybody the same, giving everybody the same interests, the same passions. Madison says that, argues in response to that that's not possible. And in the paragraph we looked at yesterday, he talked about the connection between man's reason and what Madison calls his self-love. What Madison means by self-love is obviously self-interest. And so what Madison is saying here is that as long as man has reason, and as long as man is free to exercise that reason, he will use that reason to support his self-interest. And consequently, his whole point is, and this is the sentence he uses, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. And then he specifically goes into the idea of the diversity in the faculties of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. In other words, Madison is arguing that interest groups are natural, factions are natural, because it's man's self-love that drives them. Man's self-love and his ability to reason and calculate and figure out how best to satisfy his self-love or his self-interest will logically lead him to unite or organize with other people who have the same interests. And as long as people are free, and Madison says we'll never tamper with freedom, then factions are going to result. And he points out that the differences in the degrees and kinds of property and the differences between people in terms of their unequal faculties for acquiring property is going to result in the fact that some people are going to do better than other people. In other words, inequality is a result of the exercise of freedom driven by self-interest and reason. So inequality is a natural part of a free society. And Madison says in one of his, it seems to me, most important statements, the protection of these faculties, in other words, the protection of man's freedom to pursue his own self-interests, is the first object of government. Government's number one priority is to protect people's freedom to pursue their self-interest. And he said the result of this is going to be that different degrees and kinds of property are going to result. And the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensures that society will be divided into different interests and parties. In other words, what Madison has done is go through an analysis to make the point that parties or factions, interest groups, are something we have got to deal with, because there's no way to eliminate the causes. He has pointed out there are two ways to eliminate the causes, and then he's shot down both of those ways. So in effect, the conclusion that Madison is forced to reach, the conclusion that he wants us to reach as we read this document, is that we're going to have factions. And so the next thing we got to do is figure out how to handle them, how to control their effects. So to go on to the very next paragraph, in Federalist number 10, Madison picks up at this point and says, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. In other words, what Madison has done analytically is demonstrate that the latent causes of faction are sown into man's nature. I'd like to stop there for a moment, because that point, it seems to me, needs to be focused upon. We need to focus on that for a while. Because many people, and I have to include myself among them for a long, long time, many people drew the conclusion from that man's innate inclination to belong to factions, the fact that factions are sown into the nature of man, leads one to believe that man's nature is driven by self-interest. It's owned by self-interest. It's dominated by self-interest. And therefore, that there's no room left for conscience, or what David Hume and the other Scottish philosophers referred to as the moral sense. That, in other words, self-interest so dominates human nature that somehow, if we're going to have a stable republic, we're going to have to find a way to deal with it. Let me clarify the point that I'm trying to make here. What I'm suggesting is that many people, and I was one, many people draw the conclusion that if the latent causes of faction are sown into the nature of man, then that effectively defines human nature as Madison sees it. In other words, people tend to draw the conclusion from that Madison supports what I believe we've called previously the dark side of human nature. That man is driven by self-interest, and nothing can change that, or nothing can alter or soften that. I would suggest that many people have reached the conclusion that our Constitution, our entire political system, is based on the assumption that man's nature is evil. And of course, going back in religious history, going back into the scriptures prior to Christianity, back to Adam and Eve and the idea of original sin and the fall from the Garden of Eden, and all of that tradition, all that heritage, seems to reinforce the idea that what Madison has done here is merely come to the obvious conclusion. He's dealing with man the way man really is. Consequently, their conclusion has been that the reason the Constitution of the United States has lasted as long as it has is because it is based on man as man really is. I want to, at this point, raise questions about that. Because we know that a republic is based on the existence of what these folks in the 18th century called, and what we've called, civic virtue, public virtue. Popular government, Republican government, is driven by the assumption that civic virtue in citizens is not only possible, but in fact exists. I think the conclusion we have to deal with, we have a contradiction facing us here. And that is that a Republican government dependent upon civic virtue is totally contradictory to the human nature that Madison seems to define here. So the question, it seems to me, is how we resolve that contradiction. Madison talked about the most considerate and virtuous citizens. The most considerate and virtuous citizens are the ones who somehow can put aside their self-interest in the favor of the public interest. Later in the document, Madison calls these considerate and virtuous citizens. He makes the point that they are the ones whose sense of justice and love of freedom somehow enables them to define the public interest. I would raise a question, a contradiction. If human nature is defined by the fact that the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man, then where do the most considerate and virtuous citizens come from? They're human beings as well. Is their nature different than ours? That doesn't make sense. I have a real problem getting around that. Because I do respect Madison's mind. And I do appreciate the fact that Madison is way too bright to have written himself into a blatant contradiction like that. Something must be wrong. Well, lo and behold, you get further and further into the issue. Namely, you begin to read more and more of James Madison. And you begin to discover that there's a serious question whether this dark side of human nature view that many people conclude from Federalist number 10, and of course from Federalist number 51, that's the one where Madison says if men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. And suddenly, one begins to see the possibility of another option. Madison says that the latent causal factions are sown into the nature of man. In other words, he says that self-interest is there. But he doesn't say that self-interest dominates. We say that. We're the ones that conclude that. And those of us who have a vested interest in believing in this dark side definition of human nature will use Madison as support for their argument that man's nature is indeed evil. So again, I think, and again, I conclude myself in this group because for many years, when I wrote my dissertation, I bought into this. I believed that when Madison said that the latent causes of faction are sown into the nature of man, I concluded from that Madison was saying that man's nature is evil, that man is driven by self-interest and nothing else. And of course, that's very popular. A lot of people want to believe that. Many people believe, again, that our whole constitutional system is formulated on that assumption. And that's why many people believe that our Constitution has been so successful. And I've heard people say that. It's the only political system in the history of the world that's organized the way man really is. I believe that. I thought that I knew what man really is. Or at least I felt that Madison knew what man really is, and Madison set up his entire system based on that. We've got to deal with factions. We can't do anything about them. They're sown in the nature of man. You can't make everybody the same, because as long as you believe and support freedom, and as long as you are willing to support people's freedom and use of reason to pursue their own self-interests, you are going to end up with different groups, with factions, with interest groups, with parties, whatever you want to call them. Makes perfect sense. But as you read Madison, and as you read some of the other Federalist papers, you begin to see that Madison is not totally 100% supportive of this idea of the dark side. For example, in Federalist number 39, I think I may have quoted this passage yesterday, Madison is talking about Republican government, and he's talking about the fact that citizens in America are ingrained with the values and the principles of republicanism. In other words, whatever kind of political system we create, it has to be based on republicanism, because that's the genius of the American people, Madison calls it. He says it is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with the honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom, to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. We have to believe that man is capable of self-government. In other words, we have to believe that a republic can work. If you believe in self-government, then you can't subscribe to the dark side of human nature. It doesn't make sense. And then when you go back and you look carefully at what Madison said, including what he didn't say, he said that self-interest factions are sown in the nature of man. But he did not say that this self-interest is so powerful that it drives and dictates and defines human behavior for one's entire life. He never said that. We say that. And those of us whose background is in Christianity will go back to Scripture and say, there it is. It's perfectly consistent. In effect, I think we're putting words into Madison's mouth. We are drawing conclusions from what he said, what he wrote, that are way beyond, I believe, what he believed. This passage from Federalist number 39, when he talked about mankind's capacity for self-government. And then Madison's final sentence in this passage in Federalist number 39 says the following: if the plan of the convention, therefore, be found to depart from the Republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible. Madison is saying that if the Constitution of the United States violates the principles of self-government and republicanism, then nobody in this country can legitimately endorse it. Madison is endorsing republicanism. Therefore, he cannot subscribe to the dark side interpretation of human nature. Let me go to what I believe is, for Madison at least, is the source. We talked about Madison's background. We talked about his education. We talked about the extent to which Madison's education was in large part defined by the elements that incorporated or constituted the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. We talked about the influence of Scottish philosophers on Madison, the writings of David Hume, the writings of Adam Smith, the writings of Francis Hutcheson. In the early 1950s, as I mentioned, I believe yesterday, Douglas Adair published in the William and Mary Quarterly an absolutely brilliant essay on Federalist number 10 and Madison. And what Douglas Adair proved, beyond any doubt, was that the key ingredients, the essential parts of Madison's Federalist number 10, are based on the writings of David Hume. You can go back to David Hume and you can find entire passages which become the focus of Madison's Federalist number 10. Douglas Adair, with absolutely no question, has proven the connection or the influence of David Hume on James Madison. Let's look at what David Hume says about human nature. David Hume says, political writers have established it as a maxim that in contriving any system of government and fixing the several checks and controls of the Constitution, every man ought to be supposed a knave, and to have no other end in all his actions than private interest. So what David Hume is saying is that political writers forever have preached the doctrine that man must be portrayed as a knave who is driven by self-interest, and that all his actions will be driven by self-interest. He goes on, by this interest, these people believe, we must govern him, and by means of it, make him, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to public good. What Hume is saying is this maxim, this political maxim, that man is a knave, is so basic, so much of a foundation to our approach to government, that it leads men to accept the fact that man's insatiable desire and ambition is so strong that the only way he can be governed and forced to do the public good is by being forced to do the public good, coerced into it. In other words, what David Hume is saying is that the established political maxim in the Western world is that man is driven by self-interest, and therefore that man cannot, in and of himself, put his self-interest aside in favor of the public interest. The only way that can happen is if you have a government or a ruler with the power to force him to do good. Without this, they say, I'm back to David Hume, without this, they say, we shall in vain boast of the advantages of any constitution, and shall find in the end that we have no security for our liberties or possessions except the goodwill of our rulers. That is, we shall have no security at all. What Hume is basically saying is that the established political maxim is that man's nature is evil. Man cannot do good because he cannot overcome his innate inclination to pursue self-interest and avarice. And the only security then, since man's self-interest is so strong, the only security then for our liberty or our possessions, Hume says, is based on the power of our rulers. It is, therefore, a just political maxim, Hume says, that every man must be supposed a knave. So, Hume is accepting the politics of this. He says, though at the same time, it appears somewhat strange that a maxim should be true in politics which is false in fact. But to satisfy us on this head, we may consider that men are generally more honest in their private than in their public capacity, and will go to greater lengths to serve a party than when their own private interest is alone concerned. What Hume is saying is that, yes, there's self-interest in man, but there's also honesty and generosity within man. And that this good side of human nature can only come out when man's alone. But the minute man's self-interest causes him to unite with other people, his goodness can't prevail. What that implies then, and I'm making a leap here, I know. But what this implies, if we go back to Madison's Federalist number 10, what this implies, if indeed Madison agrees with Hume, and I'm going to make the case that indeed that's true, then what Hume is saying is, as long as man is alone, as long as man's sense of right and wrong, his conscience, his inclination to be good, his inclination to be generous, his honor, defending his reputation in the community, as long as all of those things are important to him, they will check his self-interest. There are certain things that he'll never do because it would look bad or he couldn't get away with it or whatever. In fact, we know, we live in 21st century America. We watch the news at night and we're horrified by crime after crime after crime. And it seems like more and more of these crimes are being perpetrated by psychotics who have no conscience. They'll do the most ghastly, evil things because it suits them. Whether in fact, in other words, there's no hint of conscience or the idea that this might be wrong or the idea that I shouldn't go this way or I shouldn't do it or I shouldn't do this or at least I shouldn't do it this way. I mean, how horrified are we when we see the beheadings and the brutality being perpetrated by ISIS, for example? It violates everything that we hold dear as a culture, as a civilization. I believe that's the point, but that's a story for another day. What Hume says is that all of this is true. Man's goodness will dominate until he unites with other people with the same interest. Once he becomes a member of a party or a faction or an interest group, then the self-interest of that group overwhelms his sense of honor and right and decency and conscience and all the rest of it. There's no way that the goodness in man can prevail. What does that mean if we apply it to Madison and factions? It took me years to reach this conclusion, and I've got to tell you that it's these programs here at the Virtual Center that have kept me into this, and I believe that I'm learning. I continue to learn, and I'm so grateful for it. I'm blessed. What this means is that when Madison talks about factions, that's exactly what he's talking about. He's not talking about about human nature necessarily. He's talking about groups of people whose self-interest dominates human behavior. In other words, Madison's talking about factions, the violence of factions. And I've come to the conclusion that that's exactly what he means. The tendency or the inclination we have to take that to the next step and to put words or ideas in Madison's mouth that aren't really there, that's our fault. In other words, we bought into the political maxim that David Hume is talking about. The idea that man's avarice and greed and aggression is so strong that there's no way in the world that the goodness within him can surface or can have any effect on his behavior. I believe then that if you go back to Madison and you are more precise in the way you read him, he's talking about factions, groups driven by self-interest that will drive and define behavior. But in other places, he's talking about man's innate goodness, because if he didn't believe in it, then self-government wouldn't even be possible and we wouldn't even be here. So the only way, I believe, to address the contradiction between republicanism and self-government on the one hand and human nature on the other is to distinguish between human behavior when one is alone as opposed to human behavior when one is a member of a group. And it is the group that Madison's Constitution is designed to control the behavior of. Individual freedom remains free. Group behavior is what Madison must deal with in Federalist number 10. So consequently, I've come to see no contradiction in Madison at all. When he says in number 39, it's been found, when he says in number 39, if the plan of the convention, therefore, be found to depart from the Republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible. That seems to contradict Federalist number 10. I would argue that it does not. And David Hume is explaining how that contradiction ceases to be a contradiction at all. Hume says, the established political maxim is that man's self-interest drives him, dominates him, and therefore the only way to govern is to have a strong ruler with the power to prevent human avarice and human greed from dominating the society that you are governing. And Hume says, I'm willing to accept that as a political maxim, but he says it appears strange that a maxim could be so true in politics, which is false in fact. Now Hume is going into human nature. This is what each and every human being is about, according to David Hume. But to satisfy us on this head, he says, we may consider that men are generally more honest in their private than in their public capacity, and will go to greater lengths to serve a party than when their own private interest is alone concerned. Honor is a great check upon mankind, but where a considerable body of men act together, this check is in great measure removed. Since a man is sure to be approved of by his own party for what promotes the common interest, and he soon learns to despise the clamors of adversaries. Once you get in with other people who want and think the same way you do, then you naturally challenge those who disagree with you. You take issue with your adversaries. To which we may add, Hume says, that every court or senate is determined by the greater number of voices, so that if self-interest influence only the majority, as it will always do in the present depraved state of mankind, the whole Senate follows the allurements of this separate interest and acts as if it contained no one member who had any regard to public interest and liberty. In other words, once you allow the established political maxim to become operative, then what you have are self-interested, driven, greedy parties. People who organize to get what they want. And now you go back to Madison's Federalist number 10, and he said a faction can either be a majority or a minority of the whole. That's what he's talking about. But it seems to me, again, that the real issue here is that Madison, when he talks about factions, that's all he's talking about. He's not accepting or buying the political maxim that David Hume describes? Well, all well and good, you might say. But you're making an assumption here that because Douglas Adair claimed that David Hume had such an influence on Madison, you're assuming that if you read David Hume, you're in effect explaining James Madison. In other words, you're basically not giving Madison credit for having a mind. You're basically saying, if David Hume says it, Madison must believe it. And up to this point, that's kind of what I'm implying. I mean, I'm kind of assuming that because I haven't demonstrated, I haven't given us any proof yet that Madison does indeed think like David Hume. On the 24th of October, 1787, 1 month and 1 week after the Constitutional Convention adjourned on September 17th, 5 weeks later, October 24th, Madison wrote a lengthy letter to his friend Thomas Jefferson in France. And when I say lengthy, I mean lengthy. This letter is 17 manuscript pages long. I printed it out. It's available on Rotunda in the Madison papers. I printed it out. It printed out to 11 pages, single-spaced. So if you went through college like I did and they wanted all the papers to be double-spaced, this sucker would be 22 pages long. And in this letter, Madison sets out to explain to Thomas Jefferson the Constitution that the convention has just approved. Now the Constitution is being sent out to the states for ratification. And most specifically, Madison is concerned about in this letter about a specific issue. It's an issue that we haven't touched on here at the Virtual Center yet. We haven't gone into it a lot, and let me explain why. It's the issue of what Madison called the national government veto. He calls it the negative, the national central government negative. Specifically, what does he mean? He means that the only way that the Constitution of the United States can work is if we give the federal government a veto over all state laws that are contradictory to the new Constitution. In other words, he wants to give the federal government the power to strike down state laws that are inconsistent with the spirit and the form of the Constitution. He doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. He believes that the Constitution is probably doomed without it, because he knows from his Vices of the American Political System that he wrote in April of '87, he knows that it's the problems of the states under the Confederation that really is making the violations of human rights and minority rights possible. Madison believes if you don't give the new government the power to veto the laws of states, then the Constitution likely will not work. In June of '87, during the convention, early in the convention, it started in late May, It was scheduled to start on the 14th of May, but there weren't enough people. They didn't get a quorum until about the 25th of May. So the Constitution was the convention was only underway for a little bit more than a week when Madison in early June sent Jefferson his plans, the Virginia plan, that Randolph had introduced to the convention. And in that letter of early June, I think it was June 4th, Madison introduced the idea of the central government negative, the veto, the national veto over state laws. And he introduced that to Jefferson. When Jefferson responded to Madison, Jefferson didn't like the idea of the veto. There were a lot of other things he didn't like about the Virginia plan either. He didn't like it because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And he's consistent about that all the way through. But Jefferson believes that the veto is overkill. And in a response to Madison, written on the 20th of June, Jefferson responds to Madison's early June letter. Jefferson says, in reference to the veto, to giving this power to the central government, Jefferson says, prima facie, I do not like it. It fails in an essential character, that the whole and the patch should be commensurate. What a beautiful use of language. It fails in an essential character, that the whole and the patch should be commensurate. But this proposes to mend a small hole for a well-ordered, this promises to mend a small hole by covering the whole garment, unquote. That's Jefferson's response to Madison on the veto. In this letter of October 24th, when the convention ended and Madison didn't get the veto, he's still defending it to his friend Jefferson. He's still talking about the veto and why he believed it was necessary. And then he starts talking about man's nature. He's talking about what later becomes Federalist number 10. He's talking about how you control the violence of factions. And he says, encroachments, this is his defense for the veto. He said, encroachments of the states on the general authority, sacrifices of national to local interest, interferences of the measures of different states, form a great part of the history of our political system. In other words, the reason we need the Constitution is because the states are acting and doing things and passing laws which violate the national interest. And that's why we need to give the central government the power to veto state laws. And then Madison wanders into what becomes Federalist number 10 later on. And specifically, he begins to talk about the things that check human nature, the controls on man's behavior that keep him in line. In other words, Madison is questioning the political maxim that David Hume talks about. And Madison is agreeing with Hume by saying it may be true in the history of governments that it's based on the assumption that man is a knave. But the fact is there are controls on human nature, on human behavior. And then Madison, in this letter to Jefferson, begins to address some of those controls. He said, 3 motives only can restrain behavior in such cases. 1, a prudent regard to private and partial good. as essentially involved in the general and permanent good of the whole. People's sensitivity to the good of the whole, to the public interest, is, at least theoretically, a check on man's inclination to follow his self-interest. He says this ought no doubt to be sufficient in itself. Experience, however, shows that it has little effect on individuals, and perhaps still less on a collection of individuals. Madison is saying the same thing that David Hume said. That while man's innate sense of right and wrong and the good of the whole can control his behavior when he's alone, history shows us, experience shows us, that it doesn't have enough control on individuals, even less on a collection of individuals, a faction. Least of all, he says, on a majority with the public authority in their hands. If you ever give the majority faction power, there's absolutely nothing to stop it. And then you are faced with the threat of civil war and insurrection. So that's the first control on behavior. And Madison said, people's sense of right and wrong and the public good is there, but experience tells us it's not enough. Then he goes into his second control factor. And this he calls respect for character. This motive is not found sufficient to restrain individuals from injustice, and loses its efficacy in proportion to the number which is to divide the praise or the blame. In other words, respect for character for each other, respect for your fellow man, tends to become less and less and less of a check as the number of people in the group with you grows. And then Madison goes to a third potential theoretical check on human behavior: religion. And Madison goes right at it. And he said the inefficacy of this restraint on individuals is well known. The conduct of every popular assembly acting on oath, the strongest of religious ties, shows that individuals join without remorse in acts against which their consciences would revolt if proposed to them separately in their closets. Madison is saying that even in public assemblies, government, where the people in it take an oath, they're swearing according to God that they will do what's right and honest. We see over and over again that nothing stops them from supporting and doing things that they would never do in the privacy of their own closets when they are alone. Madison is saying exactly the same thing to Jefferson that David Hume wrote in his essay on the ideal commonwealth in the first half. I believe it was written in the 1740s. David Hume died in 1776, the year of the American Revolution, and most of his essays were printed in the late 1740s and early 1750s. So his essay on the perfect commonwealth is where this particular quote that I read comes from. So what have we accomplished here? We now reached the bottom of, we've completed 1 full hour of our program. We got 30 minutes or a little bit less than that to go. What have we accomplished here? It seems to me what we've done is prove with evidence that Madison and Hume are on the same page when it comes to popular government, when it comes to human nature, when it comes to people's struggles between the self-interest and the public interest. They innately have conscience. They know what they ought to do. But when they are linked or joined to a group of other people who want the same thing, too often their consciences never surface. They go along. They adopt what some of us refer to as mob psychology. They go with the flow. They do what the crowd or the group expects them to do. So what Madison has done, it seems to me, in this letter, is demonstrate clearly that he does not subscribe to the dark side view of human nature, that the political maxim which has existed throughout Western history that David Hume speaks to. Madison is challenging the validity of that. Hume challenged it. Hume said it may be true in politics. Government, that may be the only way to understand the way governments are set up, is that they're based on the assumption that man is a knave. Okay, fine, we'll go along with that. But then Hume says, but basically we need to know that it's not true. Man is not a knave. Man does have the capacity to do good and be good. Man does have the capacity to put the public interest ahead of his own self-interest. Man can be trusted to pursue the best interests of everybody. Man is not ruthless. Man is not a competitor without conscience. He's not a psychopath. Let me stop here a moment. Do you know how far we've got in Federalist number 10 today? One sentence, one line. The latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. Bang! The whole program. It's obvious to all of us. Let's get out of the 18th century for a minute. It's obvious to all of us that there are certain people and certain groups in the world, in society, who have a vested interest in driving and reinforcing the political maxim of the dark side of human nature. And at the risk of being unfair to other organizations, other groups that subscribe to that, let me talk or mention it for a moment at least and ask you to think about free enterprise capitalism as economic theory. Consumerism is driven by it. What Richard Sennett defined as the new capitalism lives on it, feeds on it, has to have it. International capitalist expansion, the expansion of the market, economic development, growth, which is defined as a good for the entire world, has become so embedded in our culture that it seemingly becomes impossible to even question it. In fact, we have names for those who do question it. We call them socialists, communists, Marxists, radicals, ne'er-do-wells, troublemakers, whatever. We have all these words for it. The significance of the Pope's encyclical, which was issued in June of this year, is that the Pope, in defense of the environment, in defense of the planet, questions the ethic which drives free enterprise capitalism. And as we have seen here at the Virtual Center, it brought out the deniers and the naysayers from everywhere who attacked the Pope because they attacked what he was saying because they feared the implications of what he was saying. So, in reality, it seems to me that Madison's Federalist Number 10 and its origins with David Hume have become especially particularly relevant in today's world. These are questions we need to ask. My God, we're destroying the planet because of what we believe that may not be true. Not only that, but the people who have a vested interest in defending that have used Madison and the Constitution and Federalist Number 10 and the founders and everything else to justify it. At this point, we've just gone beyond 2:30. It's 36 minutes after the hour. If you'll pardon me, I'm going to have to step away from the microphone for like 30 seconds, and I'll be right back.
During Dr. Bill's absence, I'll note that, in a way, what he said about we've covered one sentence of Federalist 10 sort of reminds me of The Art of War, where Sun Tzu says one thing, and then interpreters go on for page after page after page explaining what that means. That's the mark of depth. That's the mark of depth in writing.
Hey, Bob, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Dr.
Okay, go right ahead. I'll tell you what happened. Wilma came home, and my wife came home, and I didn't expect her till later today, and I locked the house up, and she couldn't get in, so I had to open the door.
I thought maybe you were having to run the scullery maid out.
No. This was to let Wilma in the house.
No, all I was pointing out, Bill, is that you're doing for Federalist 10 what the ancient sages did for Sun Tzu in The Art of War. There's one sentence, and then a whole, and then people, sages inveigh, on what it means. So
yes,
I will leave you back to it. I was just filling
buddy. Thank you.
Filling up the dead air. That's all.
I appreciate it. That's okay.
No worries.
Thank you. So anyway, it seems to me that we need to recognize that self-interest does indeed drive this definition of human nature. The political maxim that David Hume talks about is a political maxim that still has value for many people. It is a maxim that David Hume challenges. Now we have learned it's a maxim which Madison himself challenges. And the one point that I think, which is probably different for those that, and again, we covered here at the Virtual Center, maybe the first few months of the program, we were into Federalist 10, although not in this depth. But there's absolutely no question that the way most of us have been exposed to the Federalist Papers and to Madison and to Federalist Number 10 is based on the truth of a particular definition of human nature. People are selfish. People are greedy. People are self-interested. What we have to do is set up a political system to somehow convert that from disorder to order, to stability, to security. And it's very obvious that those we refer to today as the 1%, those that are at the top of the ladder, so to speak, have every interest in the world for perpetuating this particular definition of human nature. Because it is what has allowed them to be where they are, and it is what promises to keep them there. This is so important, it seems to me. What we have done and again, it's not really that dramatic when you think about it. The only thing that I'm asking you to do as we continue with Federalist number 10 is to read Madison as Madison writes. When Madison talks about the dangers of factions, he's talking about group organization for self-interest. And basically what he's talking about is the extent to which organized groups make the goodness in mankind impossible to flourish. In other words, a system based on the dark side definition of human nature is a system which must perpetuate that assumption of the dark side. The system itself requires it. Capitalism itself demands it. And the fact of the matter is our entire education system is organized around these principles, to the point that most of us don't question the fact that private interests are turning our commons, our planet, our environment into a commodity. We're selling off what belongs to all of us, and we have somehow rationalized the process of turning over ownership of what belongs to everybody to a few people. We have effectively allowed individuals to put a fence around nature, our world. We have given them permission to fence off world that we theoretically have a right to have access to. We have pushed this to the point that water and air and some of these natural things that we take for granted have become commodities in today's world. Food is a commodity. Not only that, but we have endorsed, we have even encouraged the development of communities with fences around them and guards at gates, keeping the bulk of us out of a lifestyle which these people claim the right to live without access to us. We used to think that freedom in our society gave us the opportunity to move up and acquire what other people have. Now we're beginning to see evidence that success in our society translates into the right to not have to associate with the culture and the civilization that you grew up in, that you were born into. I've talked to people that were born and used to live in West Virginia and have left. And in fact, one person that I talked to made the comment, if you can believe it, made the comment and said, I grew up in West Virginia. We were in a conversation. I grew up in West Virginia. I'm a West Virginia, but I go to great lengths to try to hide it. My God. What have we done? What are we doing? Not only to the planet, but to the people who inhabit it. So Madison has basically said that the causes of factions, the latent causes of factions, are sown into the nature of man. And now he's going to demonstrate how innate this idea of factions has become. He says, a zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points as well of speculation as of practice. An attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. In other words, we have allowed, or Madison is saying, we developed a society which feasted upon this dark side definition of human nature. And the result is people organize for any number of reasons. Different religions, different leaders, different political candidates, different political parties, different religions, different races, different high schools, different states. The University of Nebraska versus Ohio State, for example, or the University of Florida versus the University of Virginia. And what we are doing is appealing to those things which divide us rather than that unite us. And consequently, as Madison points out, what we are doing in the process is we are rendering people much more likely to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. In fact, we call those who push cooperation communists. They are so evil. They are so alien to our way of life. And of course the irony is they really are. Anyway, so strong, Madison said, is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. So Madison has made it a point to suggest that so strong is this propensity to join others in unions or parties based on self-interest, factions, that we have become almost unable to put aside our self-interest in pursuit of a common interest. But now Madison is going to return to the real substance of what's going on politically with the Constitution of the United States. Because he says in the next line, but the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Of all the things that people disagree about and people compete over, of all the things that divide us, the most common and durable cause of factions, in other words, the most insidious cause of factions, and insidious is my word, it's probably not the proper word, has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized societies, civilized nations, and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and different views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. Government's job is to regulate these varying, competing interests. And the major one are the factions that form around property. Who has it and who doesn't. And it's important to be precise here. When Madison makes reference to a landed interest, of course he's talking about planters, the so-called landed nobility, if you will, of the medieval period. Manufacturing interests, mercantile interests, merchants, moneyed interests, financiers and investors. He talks about each of these groups, and he points out that each one of them has interests which challenge the interests of one of the other groups. In other words, when government pursues a policy, economic policy, for example, a tariff, when government decides to put a tax on imports coming into the country, that's one thing. But when government decides that we really need to protect American manufacturers, we really need to protect American jobs. And the way to do that is to tax foreign goods that come into the country so high that American consumers will buy American. And that way we'll protect jobs. So obviously, that particular policy, that particular tariff, would be very popular with manufacturers. But it would not be popular with agricultural interests. Those who grow cotton and tobacco and other rice and indigo and all of those other products for sale on the international market. Because it stands to reason that if we raise our tariff prices in order to protect American manufacturers and American jobs, then the countries that our agricultural people trade with will do the same thing to them. And so for commercial interests, free trade is the optimum, where we get an opportunity to sell what we have to sell everywhere in the world. Every human being on the face of the earth is a potential consumer of our products. So naturally, you can see a situation where manufacturing interests and landed interests would be at odds, that they would have different priorities. That's true. But it's important to keep in mind that when it comes to the poor, when it comes to the majority faction, that threatens the landed interest, the manufacturing interest, the mercantile interest, the moneyed interest, all of them. Against that, they all come together. It's important to recognize that, because what Madison is doing here by pointing out different interests within the propertied class, he's implying that there are differences between them, and there are. But all I want to make the point about is that those differences do not take precedence over what holds them together, what they have in common. And what they have in common is agreement that the threat of the majority threatens them all. And against that, they can unite. This paragraph on the latent causes of factions is absolutely an incredibly important document paragraph in order to understand Madison's Federalist number 10. It is absolutely critical. So we are at 5 minutes. We're at 55 minutes after the hour. It's 5 minutes before the hour of 3. So we've got about 3.5 minutes left in our time together today. And rather than begin another paragraph or continue on with Federalist number 10 and not be able to do anything with it, I'd rather use this last couple of minutes as a period to maybe wrap up. As I've heard people in different venues say all the time, what have we learned today? Well, the one thing we learned, I think we learned a number of things. One of them is the incredible link between David Hume and James Madison in terms of philosophical outlook, in terms of philosophy. That's one thing we learned. It is not at all off base to say that Madison's writing owes an incredible debt to the mind and the writings of David Hume, Francis Hutcheson, and the others in the Scottish philosophy. It's also important to mention, and let me give credit where credit is due here, Douglas Adair in the 1950s, and most recently Gary Wills. Gary Wills has resurrected the Scottish Enlightenment as no one else has been able to do. Gary Wills has made it a point to emphasize the extent to which the philosophies and the ideas of the Spanish Enlightenment, of the Scottish Enlightenment, really dominated higher education in America. It's important to recognize that in the 18th century. The writings of Hume and Adam Smith, Francis Hutcheson, Thomas Reid, Adam Ferguson, Lord Kames. These are the people that wrote the textbooks that the founders studied from. Madison went to Princeton. The president of Princeton was John Witherspoon, a transplant from Edinburgh, from Scotland. He brought this idea, and he set up Princeton University to function like the University of Edinburgh. But it wasn't just Princeton. William and Mary, King's College, which becomes Columbia, the University of Pennsylvania, Yale, Harvard, all of these employ textbooks that are filled with the thinking and the writing and the ideas of the Scottish philosophical movement of the Enlightenment. This is what people learned. This is what people talked about. This is what people knew. It seems to me incredible that in this nation which preaches the best and the highest and the most challenging educational system of any nation on the face of the earth ever, has found a way to repress all of this in the interests of a worldview which support an economic philosophy. Oliver Wendell Holmes in the 1890s, in his famous dissent, and I can't remember the case right now, was right when he criticized the court and dissented against this particular opinion on separate but equal. It was separate but equal decision, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1892, because he argued it imposed an economic philosophy on the Constitution of the United States and on those who wrote it. And it has dominated 20th century thinking and writing and jurisprudence in this country. And it continues to do so. And so Gary Wills and Douglas Adair and the others who have resurrected the founders and have taken us back into what the founders really believed and really thought, these folks are doing a great service. We have reached the top of the hour. We'll be back again at our regular time tomorrow, 1 p.m. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you for listening. Be safe.